Chapter 13:17. Difficult questions approaching the window. Sunny opened the heavy shutters and looked at the desolate landscape of Weave from the height of one of the Nightmare Spell Temple's bell towers. The sky was veiled in impenetrable darkness. The waters flowing through the canals of the floating city glowed with iridescent radiance, bathing the empty streets in ethereal glow. Usually, the light of the great river at night was dreamlike and beautiful, but contrasted against the forlorn desolation of Weave, it made for an eerie sight. It was like a city of ghosts. He sighed, thinking about the cruel fate that had befallen the followers of Weaver, and the creature that had driven them to extinction. The Mad Prince. A dark expression appeared on Sunny's face. He was reluctant to think about his meeting with the defiled Titan, or at least some vestige of the abhorrent creature that had found its way into his dreams. It almost felt as though thinking about the abomination would summon it here. Nevertheless, Sunny had to consider what he had seen and heard in the harrowing dream, because it was too ominous. I dreamt of being Weaver. The spider with a broken leg was, without a doubt, a representation of the demon of fate. It was not surprising that Sunny had dreamt of the nebulous demon after witnessing the mural in the grand hall of the temple, and neither was it unexpected that he had assumed the demon's role in his nightmare. Weaver's blood was running through Sunny's veins, after all, and he too had an innate affinity to fate. The latter was the reason for the former. In the end, it was because of being fated that he had stumbled on the egg of the loathsome thieving bird and received the forbidden lineage of the sinister demon. Sinister. Sunny had actually never thought about Weaver in such terms before, mostly because he had benefited greatly from their tenuous connection, but also because there was no reason to. In all honesty, he had admired the mysterious demon, with no particular reason except for the fact that the demon of fate was an intelligent, cunning, and fearsome deity. But the more Sunny learned about the end of the dream realm and the nightmare spell, the more ominous of a figure Weaver seemed. And how could they not? Who could be more dangerous than a creature that wielded knowledge of fate itself? Sunny and Nephi's had argued about the nature of the spell, whether it was a fundamentally benevolent force or not. He was inclined to believe that it had been created for a noble purpose, which was not to say that it was not a vile and terrible curse for the humans of the waking world. But he was also starting to suspect that neither of them really understood the true intention and scope of what Weaver had done at all. The nightmare spell seemed like a tool to make living beings stronger in the face of encroaching corruption. But there were too many discrepancies between what was apparent and what was hidden beneath the surface. The nightmares, the slow but inevitable escalation, the sheer convenience of it all. What was Weaver's true goal? How had the rudimentary version of the spell Ankh wielded grown to become the pervasive and nearly omnipotent power that seemed to be as absolute as the universal laws of reality that the gods established? Come to think of it, how had the Doom War ended? What had actually happened to the demons, the gods, and Weaver? Where did the corruption that had devoured the dream realm come from, and why? Just like always, Sunny had no answers. More than that, these were not even the questions he had to ponder. The defilement was a form of corruption that had spread from the estuary, and there were 6 champions of it: Dread Lord, Devouring Beast, Undying Slaughter, Torment, Soul Stealer, and Mad Prince. The Mad Prince, who seemed strangely familiar when Sunny had dreamt of him. He shivered. Why did he feel familiar? The defiled horror seemed like a human, no, like a broken marionette of a human. He was like a flesh puppet worn by a boundless sea of madness, to the point where the madness seemed like the actual being, while the human body just seemed like its ragged shell. Sunny still shuddered when he remembered the creature's eyes. The torment hiding in them was like a chilling storm of insanity born from 1,000 years of horror, agony, and knowledge. Knowledge was the heaviest thing in the world, after all, as well as the origin of power. And that was why he was very uncomfortable with the fact that the Mad Prince seemed so familiar. Sonny had not noticed it at the start, because the abominable creature was too different from him. But when the sin of Solace appeared, he had to admit to himself that the defiled Titan and the sword Wraith were eerily similar, which meant that Sonny and the Mad Prince were similar, too. He stared at the ghostly landscape of Weave for a while. Have I assumed the role of that abomination? Sonny and Nephi's had discussed how strange their entry into the nightmare was. Whose roles did they assume? Who could have been present that far upstream at the moment of their arrival? He had also theorized that the Mad Prince might have died there, as evident by the piece of flotsam with deranged runes carved into it. It was strange to think that a corrupted Titan could have become an ascended tyrant, but not impossible. The spell could have decided that it was the best and only option, slightly changing the rules. The third nightmare was different from the previous two to begin with challengers entering it with their own bodies. That was one possibility. The other, more harrowing possibility was that the abominable madmen could have been the sin of Solace from the future, conjured into the present by some strange quirk of the great river. Ankh had said it herself that the flow of time in the tomb of Ariel was often strange and unpredictable. The Mad Prince could also have been the future version of Sonny, who had either been devoured by the corruption or the sin of Solace itself. No, no way, no way. He suddenly felt incredibly cold. But it was too compelling of a theory to be discarded, because of the outrage he felt at the thought of being able to turn into that bastard. The letters of the modern alphabet being mixed with the deranged runes, the ability to spread madness, the physical resemblance. It was not only the Mad Prince, either. The description of the rest of the 6 plagues was also extremely ominous. The soul stealer who could wear the skin of those he killed. The undying slaughter who was overcome by insatiable bloodlust. The devouring beast who consumed the bodies of her slain foes, the dread Lord and Torment. Didn't they sound like corrupted, twisted versions of the members of the cohort? All except Nephi's, who was incorruptible. It's too ridiculous of a thought. Sonny could reluctantly acknowledge that some form of time, distortion could have happened inside the tomb of Ariel. He could even admit that it was quite possible for them to fail in conquering the nightmare and succumb to corruption. However, what were the chances of all of them surviving that and becoming saints in the process? The 6 plagues were vastly more powerful than the members of the cohort, to the point that an entire civilization of powerful awakened had not managed to slay a single one of them. 2 civilizations, even, considering the King of Twilight and his people. No, it was far more likely that Nephi's and her cohort were pitted against nightmare creature, resembling the perverse versions of themselves, because of a little nudge from the spell. The spell had shown itself to be fond of such ghastly but poetic twists of fate, after all. Still, how had the runes of the waking world language ended up on the piece of flotsam? Sonny remained motionless for a long time, looking at the desolate expanse of Weave. Eventually, the glowing waters dimmed, and the 7 suns emerged from the river. Sonny sensed the shadows move in the adjacent rooms, telling him that Ankh and Nephi's had woken up. He closed his eyes for a few long moments. Trying to chase away the heavy thoughts, he then dismissed Saint and Imp. It was time to meet the new day. Hopefully, he would get some answers after reaching Fallen Grace. I need to strengthen Nightmare as soon as possible. The Mad Prince had invaded his dreams once, and there was no guarantee that it would not happen again. Sonny needed to protect himself while he slept, and since helping the Black Stallion evolve was also the only way for him to strengthen himself in the short term, he could achieve both goals at once that way. I'm going to have to craft some memories. Luckily, with the Crown of Twilight supplying him with essence, weaving strings of it to create memories would not be as taxing and long of a process as it had been before. thinking about how many soul shards he had and what memories to create. Sonny rubbed his face and went outside to meet his companions. They were going to leave Weave soon. Sonny, Nephi's, and Anak spent several days in the Temple of the Nightmare Spell, resting and exploring the forlorn city as they prepared for the last leg of the journey. These days were strangely tranquil and peaceful, but also bittersweet. It was because the three of them knew that their time together was coming to an end. The young priestess, who had been their caretaker and guide for the last few weeks, was not going to be able to follow her wards to where they needed to go. Fallen Grace, the city of dusk, lay far beyond the boundary of where she was allowed to exist. Such was the fate of all Riverborn. Sonny and Nephi's were both painfully aware of what awaited Anak in the future. That was why, even though they tried to hide their emotions, a dark shadow was cast over their hearts. The young priestess herself, meanwhile, seemed at peace with her bitter fate. An easy smile often appeared on her lips, and she fully dedicated herself to making preparations to send the two of them on their way. Sonny and Nephi's were going to have to travel far downstream on their own. They needed supplies and knowledge to reach Fallen Grace without Anak, so she was busy making sure they would have everything they needed. They gathered various resources from all over the desolate ruins of Weave. The young priestess also taught them how to navigate the great river and recognize various perils hiding in its depths. Nephi's continued to learn how to steer the enchanted ketch, while Sonny spent his time weaving threads of shadow essence and studying the estuary key. Eventually, there was nothing left for them in the orphaned city. As the beautiful light of the 7 rising suns suffused the cool morning air, Anak led them through the empty streets for the last time and jumped lightly onto the deck of the graceful ketch. "Come, we will sail downstream today." Sonny and Nephi's glanced at each other, then silently followed her aboard the boat. The young priestess watched them with a smile, then nodded and gestured to the steering oar. "My lady, it is best if you practice steering while I am still with you. Remember our lessons. You can surely succeed." Nephi's looked at her for a while, her face motionless. She hesitated a little before sitting down on the helmsman's bench and taking the oar. Sonny meanwhile frowned. "Wait, what about you? If we are going to sail away on the ketch, how are you going to get back to Weave?" Anak shook her head. "Weave stretches far downstream, just like it does upstream. There are several island ships we will visit before it is time for me to turn back. I will leave you at the lower house of parting, where there are other vessels for me to use." He hesitated for a few moments, then nodded reluctantly. Sonny had not come to terms with how they would have to leave Anak behind, still, but there was nothing he could do and nothing he knew how to say. They had no other choice. But the farewell was not upon them yet. Perhaps he would be able to find the correct words in the days to come. With a sigh, Sonny lowered himself to the deck. Usually, Anak would sit on the bench at the stern of the ketch, while Nephi's would be opposite him at the middle point of the deck. Today, however, their familiar positions were reversed. Neph was holding the steering oar, while the priestess sat down near Sonny. He had grown somewhat accustomed to how beautiful the young Anak was, but looking at her directly still felt strange, especially because of how bright her smile was and how heavy his heart was. "Thank you, my lord." Sonny looked at her somberly, surprised. "Me for what?" The young priestess sighed lightly, then looked at the desolate landscape of Weave with a wistful expression. "For wanting to learn about my birthplace so much. I am glad to have shared its stories with someone, very much." He lowered his head and remained silent for a few moments. "Sure, no problem." At that moment, Nephi's took a deep breath and then said something in a resolute voice. The word that escaped her lips echoed from the walls of the canal, and a subtle ripple spread across the surface of the flowing water. It was as though the word itself contained an invisible power capable of reshaping the world. Soon a strong gale rose, filling the sails of the old ketch. It was both similar and different from how Anik summoned the wind. Nef's shaping was more direct and crude, lacking stability, but at the same time, it contained a wild and fearsome will. As a result, the gale summoned by the true name of the wind was able to propel the boat forward despite not being as strong as what the young priestess had been able to call upon. The word they spoke was the same, but the result differed. It was because of the nature of the sorcery of names, unlike other types of sorcery, which acted through fixed conduits like essence threads and runes. It used the shapers themselves as the conduit. Nephi's was of a lower rank than Anik, so she couldn't channel the power of the word as potently. But at the same time, her body and soul were aflame with the divine lineage of Sun God, and more importantly, she possessed a true name of her own. Those with true names were connected to the mystical side of the world much closer, would be influenced by the hidden powers of the world much more, and be able to exert greater influence in turn. Which was why Nephi's was able to control the Ketch with a sufficient level of power despite not being a saint like Anik. "You are doing great, my lady. Speak the names of concealment next." Neph lingered, her face a little pale. The sorcery of names did not come without a cost, just like the other types of sorcery. Channeling a word put a strain on the shaper's body, as while uttering it did not consume essence, controlling the outcome did. Eventually, she gritted her teeth and said the rest of the names the priestess had taught her, arranging them into a phrase. The Ketch flew through the canals. Soon, it broke free of the city boundaries and sped into the open expanse of the great river, leaving the forlorn city behind. They were once again traveling downstream, deeper into the past. The next morning, they reached the first of the remote island ships Anik had told them about. It slowly appeared from beyond the horizon, illuminated by the dreamlike sunlight. This one was different from the House of Parting. The artificial island was much larger, and instead of a solemn and solitary building, it encompassed a whole district. There were many houses, gardens, and water features, all of them bright and colorful. Despite the same desolation that reigned Weave, this place seemed strangely festive. It was easy to imagine how full of vitality it had once been. Anik's eyes glistened with nostalgia. She smiled softly and said, her voice melodious, "This is the House of Youth." Sunny and Nephi's looked at the bright island ship, wondering what its purpose was. The sight of it was a little uplifting and a little sad. Contrasted against the beautiful atmosphere, the emptiness seemed even more poignant. The young priestess sighed. "This is one of the 7 houses that Riverborn spent their childhood and adolescence at." She lingered for a moment and then explained. "As you can imagine, children grow up differently here on the great river. From the moment they are born, their bodies are beholden to the currents of its time. If brought upstream, they will swiftly reach adulthood. At the same time, their parents will have to grow older if they wish to remain with their child. In a span of a few generations, families will be torn apart, and a city will be broken into pieces." Anik shook her head. "Of course, it is also cruel to thrust a child into adulthood while their mind remains immature. So, the 7 houses exist. Actually, it is a bit strange for me to explain these things, since that is just how life in the tomb of Ariel is. To me, it is the manner in which outsiders grow up that seems odd." She laughed. "I couldn't believe my mother when she told me that kids outside just grow up inevitably, while remaining in the same place and have no choice on when to become adults. How scary. Can you imagine?" Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other, befuddled. After a while, he cleared his throat. "Yeah, I can easily imagine. But wait, what is the exact purpose of these 7 houses?" Fallen Grace was most likely built in the same way, so it would be good to know. Plus, he was simply curious. The young priestess smiled. "It is simple, really. When a man and a woman decide to have a child, they travel downstream to the house of birth. The children are born and spend the first months of their lives there. But she looked at the waters of the great river and added, her voice wistful. As the mind of the child matures, they and their parents travel upstream to the next house, where the kids become toddlers. After a year or two, the family travels to the third house, and so forth. This way, kids have a chance to have proper childhoods. It is a happy time for the families, and moving on to the next house is a big event for the children, akin to the birthday ceremony you outsiders have. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then nodded. The river people did not have the same perception of time as the rest of humans. They still counted time in months and years, but these measurements were simply traditions brought into the tomb of Ariel by those who had come from the outside. Although there were something akin to seasonal changes within the tomb of Ariel, the idea of a solar year was meaningless here. So, the children growing up on the great river would put much more meaning into traveling upstream and getting an older body than into an empty thing like getting older by an imaginary year. Especially since their lives were not limited by the dwindling number of years that remained before they grew old and died. Anank noticed his contemplative expression and added, "This last house, the house of youth, is where our bodies reach the stage of the cusp of adulthood. The parents usually leave for the main city and leave the kids with other youths, yet different kids reach mental maturity at different paces. Some spend just a few years here before moving on to reunite with their families. Some stay longer. Some lazy rascals even refuse to become adults for decades." Her cheeks turned slightly pink. I might have been one of those rascals myself." Sunny smiled, imagining the dignified and wise elderly woman he knew avoiding the responsibilities of adulthood for as long as she could, getting into all kinds of mischief with the other young riverborn. Had Anank really been such an unruly troublemaker once? He shook his head. But wait, if that is true, then how would these youths have families of their own? They would turn into infants by traveling to the house of birth, no? Anank nodded. Indeed, that is why the whole city migrates some distance upstream each generation. That gives the young ones a chance to have children of their own. Of course, it also means that their parents grow a little older with each migration. But our lifespans are long. The future is more forgiving than the past. The eldest ones assume guidance roles in the 7 houses as well. She remained silent for a few moments. Nevertheless, a city might reach a point where the older part of its population would not be able to migrate anymore. That never happened to Weave, since many died in the battles against the corrupted, and those who survived too long usually chose to leave from the house of parting. Our history also does not stretch that far. But downstream, where the great cities of Sibyls used to be, that was how new settlements were created. The young split off to start life anew. Sunny and Nephis remained silent, thinking about how bizarre the civilization of the great river was, after all. The way of life of the river people was indeed completely different from the outside world. Even simple things like parenthood, childhood, and growing up were entirely unlike what they knew. Life always finds a way. Which was why it was even sadder to see it destroyed, how it had been here in Weave. Anank sighed. There had been a single migration after I left the House of Youth, so I will be able to guide you past all the 7 houses to the House of Parting far downstream. It should not take us more than a few days. With that she turned to Nephis and smiled. In the meantime, my lady, I will help you grow accustomed to controlling the catch. As she and Neph talked, Sunny looked at the bright buildings of the House of Youth, which were drawing closer and closer, and then slowly drifting past. He was thinking about what Anank's childhood must have looked like, as well as about the bleak and cold childhood of his own. Wasn't it funny? The young priestess, who had been born in a tomb built by the demon of dread from the corpse of an unholy titan, clung desperately to her childhood, not wanting to become an adult, while he, who had been born in the waking world, couldn't wait to leave that bitter page of his life behind. And in the end, they had both ended up in this catch together. Sunny sighed. It would be nice if the kids of the future, the waking world's future, could live like her and not like me. That was such a strange thought. Eventually, Anik replaced Nephi's at the steering oar. Neph looked drained after commanding the winds for an entire day. Nevertheless, Sunny felt that her eyes were duller than mere exhaustion could explain. Throwing a questioning glance at her, he asked, "Are you all right?" She lingered for a few moments, then nodded silently. Sitting down and leaning her back against the side of the ketch, Nephi's then tiredly closed her eyes. She had not slept since they left Weave, and although masters like them could easily remain awake for days, mental fatigue still had a way of catching up to them. I guess she doesn't want to talk about whatever it is that's troubling her. Sunny studied Neff's pale face, then quietly summoned Nightmare and ordered him to guard her dreams. The tenebrous steed hid in the shadows at the bow of the boat, formless and watchful. Not satisfied with that, Sunny sent all but one of his shadows to augment him. Memories of meeting the manifestation of the Prince of Madness still haunted his thoughts. Later, there was nothing for him to do but continue weaving threads of essence. Sunny sat on the deck of the ketch with his legs crossed, his fingers dancing in the air. By now, he was proficient enough in creating essence strings to not pay a lot of attention to the process. It was a far cry from when he had attempted weaving for the first time and constantly cut his hands to the bone. His painfully gained experience and the increased sensitivity that bone weave granted to his fingertips made it easier. Now, Sunny just needed time and essence to create as long a thread as he needed to weave a memory. It still took some time. After a while, Anik looked at him with curiosity and asked, "My lord, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing?" Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then turned his head slightly. He hesitated before answering, knowing how weird she was about all things involving the demon of fate. Nevertheless, eventually, he said, "I am creating essence strings, weaving." Her azure eyes widened slightly. You are a weaver, my lord." "A weaver?" Sunny tilted his head. "If you mean someone who uses weaver sorcery, then yes, although I am not very proficient with it." The young priestess was staring at him with reverence. He sighed. "Why were these weavers very rare in your time?" She nodded slowly. "Extremely so, my lord. The sorcery created by the demon of fate was not something mortals could easily learn, or gods even. There were only a few who mastered it. One of the two high priests of the nightmare spell was one such sorcerer. My mother told me that he was a shaper of souls and a master of all kinds of magic. Are there a lot of weavers like you in the future?" Sunny slowly shook his head. "No, there are a few whose aspects allow them to create memories, but as far as I know, I am the only one who truly knows how to weave sorcery, unbound by the limits of my abilities." He sighed. "I never had a teacher, though. Everything I know, I've learned myself. That is why I can only create copies of the weaves created by the spell, or modify them at best." The young priestess looked at him silently for a while, then smiled. "But my lord, wouldn't that mean that the nightmare spell is your teacher? How can there be a better teacher than that?" The corner of his mouth twitched. Suddenly grim, Sunny looked away. "I guess the spell has taught me a great deal of things indeed." Anink's smile widened. "You are beloved by fate then. I feel at ease." He hid his face, not wanting her to see the dark resentment drowning his eyes. Beloved by fate, huh? Sunny was indeed fated. However, that did not mean that fate was especially kind to him. It just meant that he was wrapped in its strings like a helpless puppet, doomed to always be at its mercy. In a sense, it meant that he would never know peace. Not until he learned how to rip those strings apart. It's much more like I am cursed by it. But then again, wasn't his fate to become defiled, tear his face with his nails and turn into a mad abomination. Wasn't that his future? Sunny shuddered, remembering that frightening possibility. No, no way, I would rather die. I will die. If this is the only outcome, that stupid theory of mine has to be wrong. The mad prince, I will never become him. Closing his eyes for a moment, he calmed his wildly beating heart and concentrated on weaving essence strings once again. However, his fingers trembled as he did. By the time the 7 suns touched the surface of the flowing water, the swift ketch reached the second of the 7 houses. Mooring the boat to its pier, they camped for the night on the forlorn island. It looked like a place where life had thrived once, but now that vitality was gone. The children were gone, the parents were gone, and soon enough, the 7 houses would be gone too, swallowed by the eternal currents of the great river. In the morning, Sunny was awoken by the creaking of the wind catchers. After giving Anank some time to take a walk along the shore and remember the days of her childhood, they left the artificial islands and sailed downstream once again. It took them another day to pass the 3rd house. By then, Anank's appearance had changed once again. She used to look only slightly older than Sunny and Nephi's in Weave, but now it was as if she was of the same age as them, or even younger. By the time the swift ketch reached the 4th house, she seemed to be in her late teens. The mood inside the ketch had turned dark. Looking at the endearing adolescent face of the young priestess, it was impossible to deny that they would have to leave her behind soon. The house of parting was not that far away anymore. Before they reached it, though, they had to pass by the last 3 of the 7 houses. However, by the time they were supposed to come in view of the 5th, Anank's expression had turned tense. Because the artificial island was nowhere to be found, Sunny and Nephi's had learned a few things about navigating the endlessly flowing waters of the great river, but they were still unsure what distance separated each of the 7 houses from each other. Nevertheless, they quickly understood that something was wrong by looking at Anank's face. The young priestess was almost always either calm or smiling. At some point, however, a deep frown twisted her soft adolescent face, and a dark shadow was cast onto her vibrant azure eyes. Sunny was the first to notice. He studied the teenage girl in front of them, then asked, "What's wrong?" Anank lingered for a few moments. "We should have reached the 3rd house by now, my lord." There were 7 artificial islands where the children of Weave spent their childhood, and although the swift ketch was supposed to reach the 5th one, they were actually numbered in reverse order, starting with the house of birth far downstream and ending with the house of youth. So the 3rd house would have been the 5th they saw. However, it seemed to have disappeared. The young priestess studied the vast expanse of the great river, then mumbled with uncertainty, "I guess the mechanisms of the island could have broken down, sending it adrift. I haven't visited here in a long while. Still, the deterioration shouldn't have reached that stage already." Sunny and Nephi's exchanged glances. Rising to her feet, Nephi's looked north. Could it have been destroyed by an abomination? Anank did not answer for a while. Eventually she sighed. "It's unlikely, but not impossible. Maybe that is what happened indeed." The ketch continued to fly downstream, but the mood of its 3 passengers had changed. Not only was there a threat of a powerful nightmare creature stalking the waters somewhere nearby, but the disappearance of one of the islands also meant that the rest of them could be gone as well. Damnation! Sunny did not particularly care about the remaining 2 of the 7 houses, but he was concerned about the lower house of parting, the point where Anank was supposed to say farewell to them. The young priestess was intending to gift them her ketch, so she needed another vessel in order to return to Weave. There were supposed to be other boats moored at the house of parting, but if the island had been destroyed, they were going to have a problem. It's not too bad. The furthest island ship of Weave might not have been destroyed. Even if it was, Sunny could assume the form of the river serpent again, continuing to travel downstream without the catch. With the crown of twilight, he would be able to sustain that form for longer, but not long enough to reach fallen grace. There were less powerful abominations in the past, though perhaps he and Nephi's would be able to come up with a method to stay safe while he replenished his essence. There was nothing to do for now. First, they needed to reach the House of Parting and see whether it was still in one piece or not. They continued sailing downstream in grim silence. The seven suns had already plunged into the great river, suffusing it with a soft glow, when Sunny suddenly stirred and peered into the distance. A few moments later, he pointed forward and said, his voice somber, "I see something there." Anank silently moved the steering oar, guiding the ketch in that direction. A dozen minutes later, a dark shape became visible in the iridescent glow of the flowing water. It was massive and strangely shaped, rising above the surface of the river like a mountain. Without having to say anything, Nephi's and Sunny summoned their weapons. Anank called upon her harpoon as well. However, they weren't in danger. As the ketch drew closer to the ominous shape, they saw it for what it was. A shattered platform built upon the frame of some leviathan's bones was sticking out of the water, tilted and half-drowned. They first saw one of its sides, overgrown by seaweed and barnacles. It took Sunny some time to realize that he was looking at the bottom of an island ship. Soon, enormous water wheels came into sight, motionless and broken, hanging high in the air. Finally, they went around the edge of the drowning island and saw the side of it that was supposed to be the surface. The bright buildings, those of them that remained above the water, had mostly collapsed into piles of rubble. The gardens had been destroyed, and the tidy streets had turned into a labyrinth of ruins. The tall windcatchers had been shattered, their blades sticking out of the river like torn sails. It was what remained of the third house. Looking at the scene of violent devastation, Sunny felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What could have destroyed it so thoroughly? It seemed as though a frenzied titan had been let loose on the floating island. Nephi's gripped the hilt of her sword tighter. Her face was motionless, but white sparks were dancing in her eyes. An abomination. Anank remained silent, studying the ruins with a dark expression. Eventually, she shook her head. "I don't know, my lady. Let's leave this place as soon as possible." Despite her true age and her youthful appearance, the priestess was not a very good liar. Sunny could tell that she was keeping some suspicion to herself, but since Anank did not want to speak of it, he decided not to press the issue, for now. He trusted her that much, at least. The young priestess let Nephi's take the steering oar and went to the bow of the ketch, still holding her harpoon. The ketch sailed past the ruins of the devastated house, giving them an opportunity to study how utter its destruction had been. None of them said anything, but all three looked somber and uneasy. Finally, they left the drowning island behind and continued moving with the current of the great river. An hour passed in tense silence, then another. Despite Sunny's fears, no monstrous dweller of the depths attacked the small ketch. After a while, the first of the seven suns appeared from beneath the waters. The impenetrable darkness released its hold upon the sky, and a new day came, as bright and beautiful as all the rest of them. However, there was something different about this one. When all seven suns had risen from the water, Sunny noticed that far ahead of them, in the distance, the darkness still remained. It veiled the northern horizon like a wall, connecting the surface of the great river to the sky. Anank was staring at the distant wall of darkness, too, her youthful face pale. He scowled. What is it? Some ancient abomination manifesting its power, a defiled. The young priestess pursed her lips, then slowly shook her head. No, my lord, it's much worse, it is, a storm. Her melodious voice sounded solemn. A time storm. The ominous words hung in the air, as foreboding as the wall of darkness veiling the sky far in the distance. Sunny and Nephi's looked at Anik, wary because of her somber expression. This was the first time either of them had seen the young priestess show signs of despondence. The three of them must have made for a funny sight, two battle-hardened warriors staring at a teenage girl, waiting for her guidance. Sunny frowned. "A time storm." Anik nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord. I have told you before that time can be unpredictable on the great river. There are places where it turns stale and unmoving, great whirlpools that nothing can ever escape, clashing currents and deadly tides of all kinds. A time storm is one of the most dangerous anomalies one can encounter." Her youthful face darkened. "It is a wandering disaster that twists and rips time apart, containing within itself absolute chaos. These storms originate from the span of the great river that corresponds to the final days of the Doom War, when the last cataclysmic battles between the demons and the gods were fought, and when both sides perished. They usually don't reach that far upstream. I am sorry." Nephi shook her head. "You don't need to be sorry, Anik. It is not your fault. However, how do we escape it?" The young priestess lingered for a few moments, then said quietly, "I am not sure that we can." She uttered several words, easily overpowering Neph's shaping. The wind that had been filling the sails of the ketch disappeared, and a moment later, a powerful gale crushed into the wooden boat, making it creak. This one was not summoned by anyone. Much worse, it was blowing from downstream, pushing their hair back, which meant that the dark wall devouring the horizon was traveling in their direction. At least a normal storm would. Judging by Anik's expression, a time storm behaved the same. Sunny uttered a silent curse. "Can we outrun it?" The young priestess swiftly moved to the side of the ketch and looked down at the clear water flowing past the polished wood. A few moments later, she gritted her teeth. "I don't think so, my lord. We are already caught in its outer reaches." It was only then that Sunny noticed that the current of the great river seemed to have grown much stronger. It was hard to tell when the ketch was flying forward at full speed, but now that it slowed down and was about to come to a halt, the changes were apparent even for an outsider like himself. The wind was chasing the storm in their direction, while the current was pulling them into the storm. It was like a trap. "Damn it! What do we do then?" Anik stared at the approaching wall of the storm with a dark expression. A few moments later, she took a deep breath and forced out a smile. "We will just have to brave it then, my lord and lady." Sunny and Nephi stared at the teenage girl with stumped expressions. Hadn't she said that a time storm was a roving mass of chaotic time, wild and distorted enough to be absolutely deadly? The third house had been much larger and infinitely more robust than their small ketch, but it was utterly destroyed. How the hell were they supposed to survive something like that? The young priestess shook her head. It is not as bad as it sounds. I am a transcendent after all. We, the followers of Weaver, had to pass through the tumultuous region from where these storms originate on our way upstream, so we know a thing or two about how to endure them." Her voice sounded confident, but the look in her eyes was anything but. Noticing their doubt, Anik sighed. "I am reasonably certain that I can keep this small ketch from being torn apart. It is lucky, actually, that our vessel is not too large. However—" She stared at the wall of darkness that had already drawn closer in the few minutes they were talking and grew solemn. "It is very important that none of us touches the water or becomes separated from the ketch. This storm front we see is only the aftereffect of the true disaster. The real horror lies beneath the waves, in the depths of water. No one can survive being pulled down by the raging currents of broken time. If you fall into the river, you will never come back." Sunny grimaced. His hope of being able to salvage the situation by turning into the river serpent had just been crushed. Now, His only choice was to trust Anik to see them through the disaster. It was not that he didn't trust her, but Sonny suddenly remembered traversing the dark sea of the forgotten shore on the shoulder of the walking colossus. There had been a storm then, too, and a harrowing creature hiding within the storm. His expression crumbled. There are no ancient abominations hiding in that wall of darkness, are there? Anik looked at him with surprise, then shook her head with a smile. No, my lord, even the defiled can't survive the broken time. They avoid these storms just as we do. Sonny sighed and looked downstream with a bleak face. After a while, he asked in a dull voice, "We should prepare for a rocky ride, then." The young priestess nodded. "Indeed, my lord is wise." He was not even in the mood to celebrate getting another praise. Shaking his head, Sonny started stretching his body, then froze, realizing how senseless his actions were. They were not preparing for a battle. Sharp swords and sturdy armor were not going to help them survive the storm, and neither would their combat skills. Sighing again, he asked, "What exactly do we need to do?" With no time to waste, Anik directed them on how to help her prepare the ketch for braving the storm. She tried to sound calm, but hints of urgency found their way into her voice. The preparations did not take long. They lowered the sails, then folded them neatly. As it turned out, both masts of the ketch could be taken down as well. After dismantling them, everything was either stored under the deck of the wooden boat or fastened tightly in place. 10 minutes later, nothing that could be easily torn or broken by the wind remained. The ketch turned from a sailboat into a simple and barren vessel, seemingly too small to survive a terrible storm, but also solid enough to look like it maybe could. The three of them stood on the empty deck, looking north. The wall of darkness was approaching. As the winds turned violent and the surface of the great river grew restless, Anik gave them a few simple instructions. There was not much to say, really. She would be responsible for steering the ketch, protecting it against the ravages of distorted time, and preventing it from turning over, while they had to scoop up the water that would inevitably get inside and throw it back overboard. The three of them also used sturdy ropes to tie themselves to the ketch. If the boat did overturn, hopefully, they would not be pulled into the depths of the underwater storm immediately. Sonny was not sure what would happen if Anik failed to keep their boat above the waves, though, so he didn't feel too hopeful. "Prepare yourselves." The voice of the young priestess was grave, which created a strange dissonance with her adolescent appearance. "Once we enter the storm, we won't be free of it for several days. It will be hard to endure the strain, even for ascended like you, my lord and lady. Conserve your stamina, and essence too." She lingered for a few moments, and then added quietly, "All kinds of things can happen, but fate will guide us. Have faith." Sonny gritted his teeth. If there was one thing he did not have, and never wished to possess, it was faith. The only thing he believed in was the strength of his arms and the resilience of his spirit. But Anik was different. If faith in Weaver could help her cope with the cruel truth of the world, then he didn't have the heart to diminish it with his words. So he remained silent. "Let's survive this." Looking at the wooden dipper he had been given, Sonny sighed. Who knew that he would miss traveling inside the giant alloy coffins of the House of Night one day? The wall of darkness, meanwhile, was approaching. The winds were growing more and more violent, their howls drowning out all other sounds. The current of the great river had turned fast and erratic, carrying the ketch forward with frightening speed. Tall waves rose and fell, and the wooden boat rose and fell with them, strong impacts reverberating through his bones. Several days of this, Sonny finally understood why Anik had said that enduring the storm would not be easy even for the inhumanly strong and resilient ascended like them. Plus, it was not a mundane storm either. Eventually, the ketch plunged into a thick mist. A few moments before it did, The light of the seven suns suddenly grew strange and distorted, as if someone had covered the sky with a muddy prism. Sunny's hair stood on end. He experienced a very eerie and uncomfortable sensation, a sensation of the laws of the world coming undone around him. Maybe time, which had always been a constant, did not feel solid and reliable anymore. Instead, it was wild and chaotic, playing strange games with his perception. Even the shadows surrounding him were fragmented and twisted, stretched endlessly or moving in an impossible manner. It was rather maddening. He felt nauseated. And apart from this bizarre sense of wrongness, the ketch was being thrown around like a toy by the waves. His body was being jerked from side to side, up and down, experiencing moments of weightlessness and rough impacts. The winds were battering him, throwing streams of water at his face. The roaring of the storm was deafening. Blinded by the furiously swirling mist and the drops of water flying into his eyes, Sunny instantly felt miserable and afraid. People had always been frightened in the face of raging nature. But here, it was not even nature. Instead, the storm surrounding them was entirely unnatural. It was just as harrowing still. And it was only growing stronger. They were only at the outer boundary of the unnatural disaster. As Sunny wondered how they were going to survive several days of this torture, if the ketch wasn't destroyed sooner at that, he heard Anank through the cacophony of the raging storm. The names she had spoken were unfamiliar, and judging by the strain in her voice, they were not something the young priestess could easily use or invoked often. Nevertheless, after she spoke these words, the nauseating distortion of the time storm seemed to have subsided a little. The ketch was still climbing the tall waves and plummeting from them, and the winds were still as violent as they had been a moment before, but the physical hardship of enduring their ruthless assault was at least tolerable. It was as though an invisible bubble of more stable time appeared around the small ketch, keeping the worst of the chaos away. Sunny turned his head to look at the young priestess. Anank was holding the steering oar with both hands, looking into the mist with a focused expression. Her youthful face was pale, but her azure eyes were full of stalwart determination. She controlled the ketch with a skill born from hundreds of years of living on the great river, somehow guiding it through the towering waves and chaotic currents. Then he glanced at Nephi's. Her eyes were burning with white flame, the light fabric of her tunic fluttering in the wind. Finally, Sunny looked down and let out a heavy breath. Bending down, he scooped up the first portion of water and tossed it into the mist. His hand trembled for a moment. Were they really going to live through this? Sunny had lived through a great deal of things, many of which no one had any business surviving. He had often imagined his death as well. In his imagination, that death always came at the hand of a powerful nightmare creature or a similarly powerful human. Sometimes, he imagined dying of old age in a comfortable bed, too. One thing Sunny very rarely imagined, if ever, was being killed by a dumb, mindless force of nature. Perhaps it was vain, considering the kinds of environments he often ended up in, but still, he was unwilling to succumb to something so senseless. I survived a fight with a great beast, damn it. Was he going to die because of a weird storm? Like hell I will. Not to mention that there were the lives of Nephi's and Anank to consider, too. Encouraging himself like this, Sunny endured another wave and scooped more water from the wet deck. The mist swirled and boiled around them, and the small ketch was being pulled deeper and deeper into the storm. The time storm raged all around them. The current of the great river, which had always been calm and constant, turned into a furious tide, being carried and tossed around by it. The ketch flew forward with terrible speed. Tall waves rose and fell, and hurricane winds howled like frenzied beasts. Everything around them was drowning in a boiling fog. Blinded by it, deafened by the roaring thunderclaps, the three of them had lost all sense of time and direction. There was only the feeling of the wet deck beneath their feet, the soaring and plummeting of the wooden boat, and the physical strain of enduring the cataclysmic fury of the storm. Faced with its inconceivable wrath, Sonny couldn't help but feel how tiny and insignificant he was in the face of the unnatural disaster. And that was with Anink holding the worst of it at bay, as well. The eerie, deeply distressing feeling of the immutable laws of the world turning vague and volatile was still there, muted but indescribably oppressive. He felt sickened, both physically and mentally. It was as if the solid foundation of his very being had suddenly been replaced by shifting quicksand, leaving him shaking and unstable. Perhaps that was what madness felt like. Damnation. Steeling his heart, Sonny tried to ignore the appalling sensation and concentrated on his task, scooping up the water that had been thrown into the ketch by the storm and tossing it overboard. There was a lot of it, but he and Nephi's could still keep up. It was just that. This simple task had turned out to be much more demanding than he expected. Simply existing in the wildly rocking boat was already an exercise in endurance. Considering the dire speed of the current and the height of the waves, it felt as though some demented giant was playing catch with their bodies, throwing them high up, and then slamming them down with ferocious power. Keeping his balance was not only tiring, but also difficult. Every muscle in his body was under strain, seemingly at all times. The movements of the jerking catch were chaotic and impossible to predict. However, failing to follow them was tantamount to death. If Sonny was not careful and failed to continuously adjust to the constant changes, he would be thrown down on the deck, or worse yet, tossed overboard into the seething water. And he had to do more than simply exist. He had to move, scoop up water, and throw it back into the raging river. Of course, there were more efficient ways of accomplishing that task. He could do more and do it better with the help of shadow manifestation. But their struggle against the storm was going to be an arduous marathon, not a sprint. Currently, he felt only slightly tired. That tiredness was going to turn into a crippling exhaustion sooner rather than later. Then, he was going to have to burn through his essence to keep his battered body moving, hopping against all hope that his reserves were deep enough. Wasting it on frivolous things would have been a short-sighted decision. I was wrong. Before they plunged into the storm, Sonny had noted that it was not a battle, but it was. It was just as physically straining, just as violent, and just as deadly. The difference was that he couldn't remember a battle that had lasted for many days without ever allowing the fighters to rest and breathe for even a minute. How dreadful would that be? At least the enemy was a mindless force of nature. An enemy like that did not require him to think too much, thus draining his mental powers. While arduous and exhausting, his task was not too far from being mechanical. Sonny still had to remain focused and actively pay attention to the motions of the catch, but he didn't have to think, analyze the situation, and come up with lethal schemes. Same went for Nephi's. Anink, however. Her task was much more difficult than theirs. Not only did the priestess have to maintain the mystical protections around the ketch, she was also responsible for steering it. The small boat would have already overturned a dozen times, if not for the swift and precise judgment of their guide. Sonny looked back at the small figure of the young girl who was holding the steering oar firmly, peering into the mist. Her face was pale, but her eyes were brimming with focused resolve. He was worried about her. He was worried about a great deal of things. For example, about the fact that they were barely a few hours into the storm, with multiple days of this hell still remaining before the ketch escaped it, if nothing unexpected happened. One step at a time. One step at a time, one wave at a time, one thunderclap at a time. That was how they were going to survive the time storm. That was how Sonny and Nephi's were going to survive the third nightmare as well. And after that, Sonny did not have even the slightest idea what was going to happen after, if he became a saint. not only to him, but also to humanity itself. The great clans were going to continue their war. The waking world would continue to crumble. The nightmare spell would continue to pull them all deeper and deeper into the mysterious machinations of the demon of fate. Let's survive the damned storm first. Cursing under his breath, he bent his knees to lessen the impact of the wooden deck hitting his feet, endured the ketch plummeting from the crest of a tall wave to crash violently into the water, then hurriedly threw several scoops of foaming water over the side of the boat. A few steps away, Nephi's was doing the same. The world seemed to be coming undone all around them. Separated from the abyss of broken time only by the thin deck of a wooden boat, they sailed through the raging mist. Sonny had long lost the track of time, if it even existed in this furious abyss. The howling of the wind and the roar of harrowing thunderclaps had fused into a deafening cacophony, making his ears ring. His sight had been robbed by the boiling mist and the torrents of water. His lungs were on fire, and his muscles felt like they were on the verge of tearing. It was not easy to bring an ascended to such a sorry state through sheer physical hardship, but here he was, feeling like dying. With each passing hour or minute, maybe, Sonny was using more and more essence to supplement his failing strength. The ketch was still being carried by the tumultuous current, dancing between towering waves. The world was veiled by mist and darkness. He was still scooping up water, which was now sloshing around his ankles. The wooden dipper Anak had given him had broken some time ago, replaced by an iron bowl. How much longer? Sonny was not sure what he was trying to ask himself. How much longer before they escaped the storm or before they drowned? In any case, he longed to drop on something solid, unmoving, and rest, even if that rest would last forever. The deck suddenly lurched upward and he toppled, hitting it with his head. For a moment, Sonny saw stars, but even the stars were dancing wildly, tossed around by the cursed storm. There was no answer. He had attempted to measure time by how fast his essence replenished, hoping that the crown of twilight would tell him when dawn and dusk came. But even the great memory succumbed to the vagaries of broken time. It activated and fell silent with no rhyme or reason, acting as bizarrely and chaotically as the deadly storm around them. All that Sonny knew was that it had to be a day, 2 days maybe, since they had entered the wall of darkness at least, even though it felt like an eternity. The only measure of the passage of time that Sonny and Nephi's had was Anak, although that, in and of itself, was one of the most frightening things. The young priestess was still steering the ketch, now slumped and barely holding on to the oar. However, her appearance had changed. If before she looked like an adolescent girl in her late teens, now she seemed more like a child, no more than 12 years old. Anak had always been a person of small stature, but at the moment her body shrank even more. The dark mantle she wore looked almost comically large for her delicate frame, which seemed to drown in its folds. Nevertheless, she never wavered in her duty, keeping their small boat afloat despite the harrowing fury of the great river. Even knowing that the priestess was a couple of 100 years old, Sonny couldn't help but feel his heart tight when he saw a child struggling against the same hell he and Nephi's were being tortured by. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Picking himself up from the deck, Sonny gritted his teeth and continued to scoop the water up. The slower he was, the heavier the ketch would become, and the heavier it became, the more peril they would be in. It was already a miracle that the old boat continued to withstand the ruthless cruelty of the storm. It couldn't continue for much longer. Not only because the wooden hull of the ketch could split apart at any moment, but also because the chaotic nature of the time storm was growing more and more eerie and violent around them. Despite the bubble of stability created around the boat by Anak, they could feel it. Sonny thought he saw strange shapes in the mist. At other times, he felt his own body and mind changing for a split second before reverting to their previous state. The same was happening to Nephi's. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things, but her figure and face seemed to be changing from time to time. Her silver hair always seemed to be of different lengths. Her beautiful face appeared as usual one moment. Then it would turn into the pale face of a drowned corpse for a fraction of a second, or become burned and charred beyond recognition. As soon as he blinked, the changes would disappear, and Neff would turn into her usual self. Shuddering, Sunny thought about what she saw when she looked at him. Did she see his face become covered by countless scars, turning into a demented mask of mutilated flesh, his eyes changing to contain boundless madness? But even that was not the scariest part of the time storm. The scariest part was that Sunny could hear the vague echoes whispered by a familiar voice, as if the spell was talking to him. Even they sounded senseless and twisted, broken beyond recognition, as though even the nightmare spell was not above being affected by the harrowing calamity. He had seen it rendered powerless only once before, in the Red Colosseum, which had been created by hope. According to Anik, the time storms were echoes of the final battle between the demons and the gods. Was it such a surprise, then, that the authority of the nightmare spell was disrupted by them? After all, he had already known that its power was not absolute. Pushing his exhausted body and struggling to withstand the relentless assault of the dreadful disaster, Sunny withstood a powerful blow of the hurricane wind and tossed another portion of water overboard. Absolute. A sudden thought occurred to him in the midst of the infernal tempest. He froze for a moment, desperately trying to catch his breath. Was the nightmare spellweaver's attempt at creating an absolute law of their own? He was so stunned by that idea that it even seemed like the storm disappeared for a moment. It was as though the howling of the wind subsided, and a deafening silence surrounded him. No. What? It really did disappear. Bright light suddenly pierced Sunny's eyes, and he hissed, covering them with a hand. The violent rocking of the deck subsided, as well. Did we escape? Sunny lowered his hand and looked at the horizon. Then he tiredly fell onto the deck. In front of them was a vast expanse of perfectly still water. It was not just peaceful, it was actually unmoving. For the first time since they had entered the third nightmare, the great river stood still. Bright sunlight was pouring from the clear azure sky, illuminating the dreamlike vista. Behind them, the time storm rose like a dark wall. In front of them, far away, was the same veil of darkness. It surrounded the vast circle of calm water like an ominous barrier, seething with rage. The circle of calm water itself, meanwhile, was like a flawlessly flat mirror. It shone with reflected sunlight, making it seem as though they were drifting on the surface of a radiant star. Sunny closed his eyes, then covered his face with both hands. No, we didn't escape anything. Instead, they only reached the eye of the storm. Drifting across the perfectly still surface of the water, the battered ketch slowly gained distance from the swirling wall of the dark mist. The raging winds died down, then disappeared altogether. A strange silence settled upon the world, as if they were caught in a gap between two moments. Only the subtle ripples that spread through the radiant mirror of the frozen river's surface, by the bow of the ketch, showed that this hidden sanctuary was not entirely, and eternally, unchanging. Sunny fell back and leaned tiredly on the side of the wooden boat. Breathing heavily, he looked at Nephi's, then at Anik. The silence was too sweet to break it with the sound of human voices. He was too exhausted to speak. As well, for a while, all three of them remained motionless, trying to recover from the torturous fury of the howling storm. We'll have to dive back into that hell, eventually. The thought alone made Sunny shudder. Refusing to entertain it, he closed his eyes and slumped down, intending to rest for a few minutes. Instead, he fell into the embrace of sleep almost immediately. Perhaps because of nightmare, or perhaps because even the defiled titans could not reach into the depths of the time storm, Nothing visited him in his dreams. Sonny woke up with a start when a shadow fell on him. For a split second, he was afraid that they were back in the ruthless grinder of the time cataclysm, but it was only Nephis. She had walked to the bow of the ketch to look ahead, her face pale and her eyes sunken. He stared at her for a few moments, then sighed and pulled himself upright. How long was I asleep? She lingered for a while. There's no way to tell. Sonny frowned, confused by the odd answer. However, then he felt it himself, in the place where the deep discomfort of sensing the broken nature of time had been. There was now a strange emptiness, but it was not the familiar comfort of sensing the natural flow of time, either. Instead, it was the absolute lack of it. He frowned, realizing that he could not feel the passage of time at all. It was a truly bizarre sensation, one that could not be properly described with words. His heart was beating, and his chest rose and fell as he breathed. However, he did not know how long each heartbeat took, and how much time passed between each breath. It could have been a moment, a minute, or 1,000 years. It could have been an eternity. Sonny grimaced. Damnation! What was happening now? They were alive, strangely enough. At least it seemed that way. His body ached all over, still reeling from the terrible strain of surviving the storm. Such pain was something that only the living felt. Sonny turned to Anik, wanting to ask the priestess a few questions, but remained silent in the end. His expression darkened. The priestess looked even younger than she had the last time he saw her. Now, she resembled a girl of 10 years of age at most. Her ebony hair was short and unruly, and her lovely face had become round and immature, with clear blue eyes and cheeks that had yet to lose all of their baby plumpness. Anik was sitting on the helmsman's bench, her feet dangling above the deck. Noticing his gaze, she picked up the folds of her comically oversized mantle and jumped down. "Greetings, my lord." Her pleasant voice had grown childish and awkward. Sonny hesitated, staring at the young girl. She looked nothing short of adorable, however. He did not feel uplifted by the cute sight. Instead, his heart felt as heavy as a mountain. If, when they broke free of the storm, would Anik even be able to return to weave on her own? He glanced at Nephis, who stood with her back to them, then sighed. "We'll think of something." Then Sonny turned to the child priestess and asked, "What is going on exactly?" She smiled sweetly, her azure eyes sparkling, 2 dimples appearing on her plump cheeks. "We are in the eye of the storm, my lord. Time is frozen still here. It is not dangerous, I think. It's just that." He was momentarily distracted from her words by a subtle movement in the water. The strange thing, though, was that he did not sense any shadows shifting. Turning his head, Sonny glanced outside the ketch. The surface of the great river was perfectly clear and flat, turning into a giant mirror. The azure sky reflected in it seamlessly, suffused with bright sunlight. It was as though the entire world was shining with a splendid radiance. The sight of it was like a vision from a beautiful dream. However, there was something beneath the radiance. Sonny heard Anik end the sentence as he peered through the light. "We shouldn't look at the water." Her warning came a split second too late. The scream died in his throat as he saw a pale figure moving across the surface of the water with calamitous killing intent, shrouded in countless layers of furious darkness. That rippling darkness was boundless and unfathomable, containing within itself an infinite number of choices. The features of the harrowing figure were vague and obscured, and all he could see was a pair of terrible wings, their feathers black like those of a raven. They spread, vast enough to devour the sky and drown the world in howling mist. Staggering back, Sonny fell to his knees and vomited blood. 2 streams of it burst from his nose, too. Blood weave, which would usually prevent something like this, was reeling in stupor, and so was he. It was as though his mind had suffered a tremendous shock from witnessing the dark figure, and sensing the harrowing depth of its obliterating killing intent. Hurting and disoriented, Sonny wiped the blood off his face and spat. What the hell is that?" Anink remained silent for a while, uncharacteristically solemn. Then she said in a low voice, "Those are reflections of the gods, my lord, and of the demons that slayed them." Sonny wiped the blood off his lips and remained motionless for a while, staring at the wooden deck. There was an irate expression on his face, and when he threw a furtive glance to the side, his body trembled slightly. "That's great. The reflections of the gods and demons." It made sense, in the senseless kind of way that seemed to be prevalent here in the tomb of Ariel. The time storms were echoes of the final battles between the demons and the gods. They had been created when the aftershocks of those unimaginable clashes reached the great river through the titanic walls of the Black Pyramid. So, it wasn't that unusual that there were reflections of the awesome deities still remaining in the eye of the storm, where time was frozen still. Whose figure had Sonny witnessed just now? Nephi's, it seemed, also wanted to know. "What did you see?" Her voice sounded nonchalant, but he could tell that she was curious. Sonny groaned and sat down, then summoned the endless spring to take a sip of water. Washing the taste of blood off his tongue, he lingered for a moment and said in a somber tone, "I think I just saw Nether in full war mode, going all out." The harrowing figure which was shrouded in darkness. Sonny was not certain, but he felt that it was the prince of the underworld, Nether, the demon of destiny himself. After all, he was also the demon of choice. And that was what Sonny had sensed within the boundless expanse of rippling darkness, an infinite amount of choices. True darkness also originated from the mists of the hollow mountains, where Nether's domain lay. Curse it! Sonny had seen a demon before. However, he had not been reduced to such a sorry state after meeting Hope face to face. Why was gazing upon the prince of the underworld so different? I guess it was not seeing him. It was feeling an echo of his killing intent. Nether's murderous will was so terrifying that simply looking at his reflection almost killed Sonny. And that was considering that he was an ascended tyrant, too. If a mundane person had glimpsed the visage of the infuriated demon, they would have probably dropped dead at the spot. Simple as that. Scary. Sonny turned to Nephi's and smiled weakly. "Neph, remind me to never get on the bad side of a deity." She raised an eyebrow slightly, giving him a dubious look. "What is that supposed to mean?" Ignoring his request, Nephi shook her head and asked, "So what did he look like, the demon of destiny?" She had spent her second nightmare in the underworld, so she must have been dying to know. Sonny remained silent for a moment. Eventually he shrugged. "I have no idea. I only saw a pair of raven wings and a figure moving within a shroud of terrifying darkness. That was pretty much it. But it was also enough to almost make me pass out, so." He looked at Anink and asked, "Are all gods and demons reflected in these waters?" The child priestess seemed unsure. "I don't know, my lord. Perhaps they are all except Weaver, who did not participate in the Doom War. War God, Sun God, Beast God, Storm God, Heart God, and Shadow God. Their reflections should be here. The same goes for the demons, the demon of desire, the demon of dread, the demon of choice, the demon of imagination, and the demon of repose. Oh, and the sixth one. I seem to be forgetting her title." Anink's childish voice grew quiet with embarrassment, and then ceased completely. Sonny stared at her for a few moments. "Right, the sixth one should be Oblivion. Oblivion is a she-ha." Then he knew the titles of all 7 demons now, didn't he? Weaver, the demon of fate, the oldest of the 7. Hope, the demon of desire, although she was also often called Desire, the demon of hope, which was not confusing at all. Then there was Ariel, the demon of dread, and the demon of oblivion, whose name had been forgotten by all. Nether, the demon of destiny or choice, was the youngest. The last 2 he had never heard of before. the demon of imagination and the demon of repose. Weird. Their titles did not sound particularly demonic at all. He had expected something disastrous and terrifying, like the demon of strife or the demon of frenzy. The demons had been feared above all other lesser deities after all, and perhaps even more than the gods. The word for imagination could also be translated as illusion, vision, or sight. The word for repose could also be translated as renewal, rejuvenation, and restoration. What was so frightening about these things? Well, imagination can indeed be scary, I guess. I can also imagine how ceaseless renewal might end up becoming a nightmare, sort of. Nevertheless, the two demons were a complete mystery to him. To be honest, all 7 demons were a mystery, as were all 6 gods. If only there was a place where I could learn a bit about each of them, including how they looked and fought. Right. Sunny glanced at the radiant water, suddenly consumed not only by dread, but also by burning curiosity. It was all right here, one look away. Shuddering, Sunny forced himself to turn away. What are you doing, fool? He was in the tomb of Ariel, of all places. A titanic pyramid built to bury the truths that even one of these ineffable beings had not been able to bear, and where the knowledge of those truths gave birth to the defilement. If Sunny failed to understand that not all truths were meant to be learned in such a place, then he really did not deserve to be alive. Ah, what a disappointment! Why wasn't there a demon of curiosity? Curiosity was a much more terrifying thing than imagination and repose, as far as he was concerned. Looking at the embarrassed Anak, he sighed and shook his head. The 6th demon is oblivion. Don't worry, it's her nature to be easily forgotten. You already did well by remembering that there was one more of them, really. The child priestess hesitated for a while, then nodded with a smile. Right, thank you, my lord. Trying not to look too closely at the surface of the water, Sunny turned away and peered into the distance, where the dark wall of the time storm towered like a boundary of the world. His expression dulled. The moment of respite in the eye of the storm was welcome and unexpected, but it was also doomed to be brief. Soon, they would have to challenge the fury of the unnatural cataclysm once again. The thought made him shudder. It was peaceful in the eye of the storm, if a little bit eerie. The strange lack of the sensation of time had been uncomfortable at first, but Sunny quickly found himself forgetting that time had ever existed at all. The view of the azure sky reflecting on the perfectly calm water was beautiful and tranquil. The silence was like a lullaby, making him feel at ease. Sunny had not felt such peace in a long, long while. There was no need to hurry, and no possibility to do so anyway. Without telling how long their actions took, they could not know whether they were being slow or swift either. So, it was fine to just let go and remain still for a bit, enjoying the serene stillness of the world. Which was why Sunny soon found himself feeling cold dread. And not this is not good. It was just too easy to be lulled into inaction in this strange and frozen place. At some point, Sunny realized that he did not know how long he had remained sitting with his back against the side of the ketch, without a thought in his head. His eyes widened slightly. If they weren't careful, would they end up frozen forever in the ice storm too, just like everything else was frozen in this tranquil haven? Shuddering, he turned to Anak and asked, "How long has it been since we reached this place?" She helplessly shook her small head. "I don't know, my lord." He hesitated. "How long before we dive back into the storm, then?" The child priestess peered into the distance. Her large blue eyes darkened somewhat. Nevertheless, she said resolutely, "We'll leave as soon as possible. Time might be frozen here, but it still flows outside. It is better not to linger, otherwise, fallen grace might already be destroyed when we finally escape the disaster, and I would have failed in my task." Sunny let out a relieved sigh. "Right, it is not too bad." They had not been caught in the trap of frozen time yet. Anik was proof. She had grown a bit younger after they had entered the eye of the storm, meaning that the circle of tranquil water was moving in relation to the unceasing current of the great river. Since she had not turned even younger yet, they couldn't have been idling in the serene silence for too long. She was like their anchor in this beautiful and insidiously dreadful place. Thank the gods. Sonny suddenly wanted to laugh. He could have never imagined that he would be desperate to dive back into the nightmarish havoc of the deathly storm, but here it was, the desire to escape the tranquil circle of frozen time, fast. The future was truly unknowable, and one could never say never. Nephi stirred at the bow of the ketch and looked at them, her expression stiff. I've been keeping an eye on the wall of the storm. We have drawn closer to the outer boundary, somewhat, but without the current, the ketch is moving too slowly. In fact, it is not moving at all. We will have to raise the sails and summon the wind. It seemed that she had never lost track of their goal. Sonny sighed. The nature of time might have changed, but Neff never did, at least the deepest reaches of her heart did not. She was still just like she had been all those years ago, beneath the branches of the soul-devouring tree. Back then, she had also spent all her time on the shore of the Ashen Barrow, looking west, even if she couldn't quite remember why. Her single-minded determination was something to rely on, as well. It was ironic, really. A girl whose fate it was to bring change was the most unchanging thing in Sonny's life. As he was thinking that, Anink's shoulders fell slightly. Yes, my lady, just give me a moment and I. Nephi shook her head. No, I will summon the wind and I will steer the ketch. I will guide us out of the storm when we enter it as well. The child priestess looked up at her with a startled expression. But my lady. Neff stared at her somberly for a few moments, her gaze heavy. Eventually, she said bluntly, You have grown too weak, Anink. I am sorry. Your body is not strong enough to handle the strain. You can't even reach the deck with your feet while sitting on the helmsman's bench. How are you going to control the oar? She looked down, then sighed. Walking up to the child priestess, Nephi's patted her on the shoulder and forced out a smile. Don't worry. Isn't that why you taught me? You taught me well. I will steer the ketch while you keep the broken time at bay. Each of the three of us will make sure that we escape the storm alive. With that, she threw a poignant look at Sonny. He felt sorry for Anink, but knew that Nephi's was right. Their guide was not capable of guiding the boat through a raging storm anymore. Even if it hurt her pride and went against her determination, it was time for the two of them to protect Anink instead of being protected by her. They had to make sure that she survived the storm. And after that, they had to make sure that she had the means of returning to Weave, too. How did everything become so complicated? The damned storm had thoroughly destroyed their plans. Now, all they could do was finish their battle against it, and then come up with new ones. The strain on Sonny was going to increase, considering that he would be draining the water from the ketch alone this time. But he would have to manage somehow. If there was one consolation, it was that half of the journey was already behind them. Knowing that each minute brought them closer to safety, he wouldn't need to preserve his essence as much. Sonny smiled, then clapped his hands. All right, let's get out of the eye of the storm first. Honestly, this beautiful place is way too creepy. I'll feel better once we're drowning in raging water and being battered by devastating winds. Wouldn't you? Not to mention that he was still struggling against an overwhelming desire to peer into the reflections frozen in the still water. Consequences be damned. Anink lowered her head, despondent, but there was nothing she could say. Her small frame was indeed not suitable for steering the ketch through the powerful storm anymore. Transcendent or not, she was still a child now. Feeling a sense of urgency, the three of them struggled against the lulling tranquility of the frozen time and hurried themselves, hopping to return to the crushing embrace of the storm as soon as possible. As Nephi steered the ketch toward the wall of darkness, Sonny had some time to prepare himself mentally for the arduous struggle that lay ahead of them. He also had time to observe Anik closer. What he saw did not bode well. Despite being an adult, and someone hundreds of years old at that, the priestess had regained the body of a young child. Looking at her youthful appearance, it was hard to remember how ancient, decrepit, and frail she had been once when they met her in the far future. But the change was not exactly a benevolent one. Despite being full of vitality, Anik had obviously grown much weaker. Her immature body was not as strong and physically capable as it had been before, but worse than that, the differences went deeper than that. As Sonny observed the child priestess, he slowly realized that her mind had been affected by her turning into a child as well. It was as though her head could not contain the mature consciousness of an experienced adult anymore, nor could her heart handle the powerful emotions of one with the same composure. Anik had not really turned dull or less intelligent, but there was a certain infantile straightforwardness to how she spoke and behaved now. Her eyes, which had always been wise, seemed slightly naive as well. Her mind was slowly regressing. Sonny felt cold claws grip his heart. "Curse it!" He gritted his teeth and looked down, but then forced himself to straighten. "Fine, it's fine. She has taken care of us enough, we'll take care of her now." Of course, they still needed the child priestess to protect the ketch from the ravages of broken time. Sonny hoped that she would be able to maintain the bubble of stability around the ketch, both for their sake and her own. Once they were out of the storm, they would find a way to help her return to Weave, even if it meant turning around and sailing back upstream. His heavy thoughts were interrupted by a sudden breeze that threw tiny droplets of water into his face. Sonny looked up, sensing the shadows around them shift. "We're here." The wall of darkness was already drawing close. "Hurry!" Nephi's dismissed the wind she had summoned and hurried to the middle of the ketch. Together, they swiftly lowered the sails and dismantled the masts, repeating the actions they had performed before entering the storm for the first time. By the time they were done, the water around them was not still anymore. Although weak, there was a hint of a current, pulling them toward the seething wall of dark mist. The light of the seven suns slowly dimmed, and the winds grew more violent. Sonny grimaced, sensing the bizarre transition from the absence of time to the unnerving mess of it being broken and volatile. "Come on, Anik." Despite his worries, the child priestess performed her task just as flawlessly as she had before. Submitting to her will, the feeling of time having gone mad diminished, allowing him to breathe freely. The nauseating feeling of fundamental wrongness in the world was still there, but bearable. Sonny quietly cursed. "Arg, I have not missed that sensation." The current was growing faster and faster, the still surface of the water becoming restless. Finally, waves appeared, small and weak at first, then chaotic and powerful. Standing at the stern of the ketch, Nephi steered it with an iron hand. Sparks of white flame danced in her eyes, refusing to be devoured by the encroaching darkness. "Here we go." The darkness swallowed the world once again. The tranquil silence was torn apart, replaced by the furious howling of the wind. The deck of the ketch jerked, mounting a tall wave. A thunderous thunderclap shook the world. This is it, the last hurdle. Looking into the nightmarish abyss of the storm, Sonny found Anik's shoulder and pulled her closer to him, so that she wouldn't be thrown overboard by the violent waves. Looking down, he hesitated for a few moments, and then smiled. "Don't worry, it will be fine. I once rode a saint into the depths of the ocean to fight a corrupted terror, you know. That was way scarier than this." Anik stared at him with her large azure eyes, and then nodded. "Yes, my lord." Sonny grinned, then picked up the iron bowl and prepared to scoop up as much water as he could. "Granted, I only survived fighting the Sibyl of the fallen grace by luck, and now I need to survive this storm somehow to meet her again. What a ridiculous turn of events, really. It was indeed a bit ridiculous. However, Sunny did not feel like laughing. The storm swallowed them like a giant beast. The ketch flew on the raging current, dwarfed by towering waves. The swirling mist enveloped the world, making it seem as though nothing except for the terrible disaster remained within the tomb of Ariel. The insidious tranquility of the eye of the storm seemed as though it had never existed. They had left its shelter, as well as the reflections of the gods and the demons, behind. Sunny would have felt regret at the missed opportunity to learn divine secrets, but he had no time to think about such things. Bending down, he scooped up the first portion of water and tossed it back into the mist. His body did not ache for now. His reserves of essence were not empty for now. His mind was not numbed by the sickening feeling of time breaking apart for now. All these torments would come soon. And then, hopefully, he would leave them behind as well, to make space for some new horrors without a doubt, but one day at the end of it all. A bright future awaited him, maybe. For now, however, what lay ahead was the past. Sunny had to travel far into the past, meet dusk of the fallen grace, find the members of the cohort, and conquer this damned nightmare. Shielding his face from the devastating blow of the wind, he gritted his teeth. Really now. They were braving a storm of broken time in the company of a 200-year-old child, who was a priestess of the nightmare spell. Sunny chuckled. No one is going to believe this crap. The time storm seemed even more violent the second time around. The deafening howling of the wind had grown deeper and louder, sounding more like a monstrous roar now. It was as if an enormous beast was struggling to break free of its chains somewhere below the waves, its voice reverberating across the entire world and shaking the heavens. The sky itself seemed like it had been torn asunder and collapsed. A flood of boiling mist poured through its broken dam, devouring the seething surface of the great river. The tiny speck of the wooden ketch flew through the howling abyss, surrounded by frenzied darkness. Sometimes, a thunderous crack would drown out the fury of the storm, as if the pillars of the world were fracturing and crumbling apart. Then, a blinding flash of lightning would momentarily illuminate the turbulent expanse of dark water. Hidden by the mist, colossal waves rose and fell like black mountains, carrying with them an obliterating weight. And those were only the outward manifestations of the harrowing storm. Sunny did not know what kind of destructive forces were clashing in the depths of the river below the ketch, but he could feel the nature of time turning more and more twisted around them. Even protected by Anik, he could feel his body and mind twist and crack with it. Arg! He failed to contend with the furious power of the wild current and was sent tumbling, colliding with the side of the ketch. Blinded by pain and ignoring it, Sunny reached out and caught the child priestess before she was washed overboard. The ropes connecting them to the ketch became entangled, but it was the least of his problems right now. The wooden boat was creaking and groaning around them, seemingly on the verge of breaking apart. Nephis had firmly planted herself at the stern, holding onto the steering oar with all her might. White flames were dancing in her eyes, and soft radiance rose from her skin, made vague and unclear by the veil of mist. The ketch was falling from a towering wave, and Sunny felt weightless for a moment. His body was actually separated from the deck, drifting upward. He had to activate the feather of truth and make himself heavier in order to not be tossed into the air. Placing himself between the wooden deck and Anik, Sunny gritted his teeth. A moment later, the crushing impact of the fall came, knocking the wind out of him. Hurt, suffocating, he whispered a quiet curse. The ketch was filling up with water. How was he supposed to drain it if he couldn't even remain standing? They had done well up until now. It was impossible to tell how long their dreadful journey through the storm had lasted, but judging by how tired and battered his body was, it couldn't have been a small amount of time. Despite that, there was no sign of the furious disaster growing any weaker. In fact, it was only becoming more violent and dire, and now his strength was failing him. I can't resist it with just my body anymore. Sonny knew that he had to conserve his essence as much as possible, yet the situation had become too desperate. Even if it was too soon, there was no other choice but to burn the bridges and open the floodgates, hoping that the storm would subside sooner than his reserves ran dry. If not, "It's going to be all right, Anik. We'll just have to hold on for a little bit more." His whisper was too quiet for the child priestess to hear through the deafening roaring of the storm, but it made him feel stronger. Pushing himself off the deck, Sonny threw a somber glance at Nephi's. Changing Star was standing at the stern of a ketch like a beautiful statue, surrounded by a white halo. Her slender figure, silhouetted by the fluttering fabric of the windswept tunic, was the only source of light in the ocean of seething darkness. Her face was pale and motionless, turned into a porcelain mask by the torment of her torturous flaw. Neff's eyes were grim and radiant, burning with furious resolve and cold determination. She was struggling just as much as he was. She was also just as stubborn and relentless as he was. Together, they were going to overcome this terrible storm, despite it all. Sonny pushed air into his burning lungs. And then for a little bit more, and a little bit more. Sparks of light ignited in the mist around him, coalescing into several memories. First, a serpentine crown of black metal appeared on his head. Then, a flute carved out of emerald bone appeared in his hand. Sonny took a deep breath and activated the royal promise, enchantment of the crown of twilight. Immediately, he felt a subtle connection form between him and the seething waters of the great river. That connection was weak and insignificant, but it was strong enough for his goals. Commanding the water like he did shadows, Sonny willed it to move. The foaming water that filled the insides of the ketch, already reaching above his shins, suddenly stirred. Flowing in reverse, it tentatively crawled up the sides of the boat and spilled into the turbulent darkness beyond. 1 second passed, then another a few heartbeats later. The remaining water was already not as deep as it had been before. This method was certainly much more convenient than draining at one scoop of the iron bowl at a time. On the downside, he could feel his essence disappearing with a frightening speed, as well as a heavy strain pressing down on his already reeling mind. "Heavy, it's heavy." Gritting his teeth, Sonny persisted. At the same time, he brought Bone Singer to his lips and blew into it. The next moment, a dome of blessed silence enveloped the ketch, sparing their ears from the staggering cacophony of the storm. The sudden lack of deafening noise left him stunned. Swaying, Sonny fell heavily to the deck and grabbed onto the side of the ketch, holding himself in place. Outside, the havoc of the time cataclysm was the same. The small boat was still being tossed around by the raging current, flying up the towering waves and then plummeting down. But inside, at least for a little while, there was silence and peace. Taking a shaky breath, Sonny lowered his head and wondered how long he would be able to keep this peace in existence. Not long. It won't be long at all. Nephi's continued to struggle against the storm, guiding them through the towering waves, but Sonny and Anik received a moment of respite. If it could even be called that. They were still inside the ketch, which was tossed around like a toy boat by the raging current. Sonny was using one hand and all of his tyrannical strength to keep himself in place while holding Anik with the other. But without the need to feverishly scoop out water, they at least could catch their breaths and remain motionless for a while. For as long as his essence lasted, that was. Sonny leaned against the wet wood tiredly, consumed by bitter exhaustion. His chest was rising heavily. Not good. Being a supreme memory, the Crown of Twilight was a very powerful tool, but correspondingly, it consumed a lot of essence. It was going to take a few minutes for his tentative authority over water to drain the entire boat. After that, it would be unwise to keep sustaining the effect of the royal promise. He sighed. What was even a minute? In this godforsaken storm, it was impossible to tell. The effects of time being broken were still ravaging them. Sonny had already grown accustomed to seeing ghastly hallucinations impose themselves on the bodies of Nephi's, Anak, and himself. There were vague, harrowing shapes sometimes appearing from the mist as well. He could never discern their nature, but the glimpses of unknown figures and events filled him with a deep sense of terror. Were they twisted fragments of the past, of the future, or something else entirely that had crawled into the world through the rifts in the broken framework of the absolute law? He did not know and did not wish to know. Perhaps this is how Cassie feels. There were shadows as well. They were just as twisted and perverse as the rest of things within the time storm. He had already limited the range of his shadow sense as much as it was possible, but he could still feel them, the chilling wrongness of them, and couldn't help but shudder. Sonny felt grim and hopeless. At that moment, a childish voice distracted him from his dark thoughts. My lord." He stirred and looked down at the small figure of the child priestess. Anak had grown even younger. Now she looked like a girl of maybe 7 years of age, tired and afraid. Her mind must have regressed further, too. She was still maintaining the bubble of stability around the ketch, but it felt weaker. She looked more like an actual child than a wise saint trapped in the body of one, as well. Sonny forced out a weak smile and asked, trying to keep his tone soft. "What is it?" Anak lingered for a while, seemingly embarrassed. Eventually, though, she whispered in a small voice, "I'm scared." Those words, they cut Sonny like a knife. The proud priestess he knew would have never allowed herself to say something like that to a person she considered her ward. The fact that she had meant that Anak was gone further than he thought. His heart grasped by the icy claws of anger and regret, Sonny struggled to keep his bitter emotions away from his face. His smile froze. "There's no need to be afraid, Anak. We will escape this storm, the three of us. I am sure of it, see." He pointed to the water, which was flowing out of the ketch on its own. What he had said to the child priestess was not a lie. Sonny desperately believed that they would, indeed, survive the time storm. Or rather, he had fooled himself into believing that. He might not have been able to lie to others, but lying to himself, that was the easiest thing in the world. Anak grew quiet, seemingly calmed a little by his words. However, her small face was still sick with fear. After a few moments, she asked again, her voice tentative. "My lord." Sonny pulled her closer to him, struggling against the sudden movements of the ketch. "Yes." She hesitated a little. "Might you tell me a fairy tale?" He froze, startled by her request. It was natural for a distressed child to want to hear a fairy tale, probably. Right. The problem was, Sonny couldn't remember any. The only one that he could think of was the strange tale of the wooden boy that Nephi's had told him about. But considering its macabre ending, he didn't think it was very suitable to tell that one to Anak. He shifted slightly, then said softly, "I'm sorry, I don't think I really know any fairy tales." The child priestess lowered her head. "Oh." Sonny hesitated for a moment. "How about you tell me one instead?" Anak looked at him in surprise, her large azure eyes widening. "Me?" He nodded with an encouraging smile. "Yes, which one is your favorite?" The child priestess stared at him, sparks slowly igniting in her eyes. She seemed to have forgotten about the terrifying fury of the storm, at least for a moment. A tentative smile brightened her small face. "Oh, it is about the Well of Wishes." Sonny raised an eyebrow, acting as if he was paying rapt attention to her words. "The Well of Wishes, huh?" Anik nodded seriously. Yes, they say that the world was born from a wish, and so a well of wishes is hidden at the estuary of the river because it flows back in time to the moment when the world was born. Anyone who reaches there will have their most dear wish come true. Sunny tilted his head, surprised by the strange logic of the fairy tale, both by how odd it was and that there strangely was logic to it at all. In the beginning, there was desire. Was it so wrong to say that the world was born from a wish? As the water left the ketch and his essence burned, the child priestess continued with a smile. There was once a brave girl who was separated from her mother by the currents. The girl couldn't meet her mother because she was river-born, but she found a magic ship which allowed her to sail the river just like an outsider. As the storm raged around them, Anik told him about the incredible adventures of the river-born girl in her small, childish voice. By the time the river-born girl found her outsider mother, the mother had grown weak and frail from old age. Knowing that time would separate them again soon, forever, the girl sailed for the estuary. Anik's voice had grown excited. And finally, she found the Well of Wishes. The girl's wish was to be with her mom, and so the well made her mother river-born as well. She returned upstream on her magic ship, and they lived together happily forever. She looked at him expectantly, all worry gone from her face. Sunny held her close, feeling the violent forces of the storm trying to throw the battered ketch down. That is a wonderful fairy tale, Anik. I liked it a lot. The child priestess smiled. You are an outsider too, my lord. You don't even need a magic ship to reach the estuary. Maybe you can find the Well of Wishes too. He didn't have the heart to tell her that what waited in the estuary was the source of the defilement, and not a magical well that granted everyone their dearest wishes. Instead, Sunny lingered for a while. Eventually, he nodded. Yes, wouldn't that be nice? Maybe I'll really find the Well of Wishes and have my greatest wish come true one day. Who's to say I won't? He smiled. The Well of Wishes. Sunny tensed, feeling the approach of an impact. It was a beautiful fairy tale. Indeed, thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.